Good morning, everybody. I will start also with the gratitude to the organizers for having me at this interesting conferences, and I take it as a nice opportunity to learn about more about policies, because myself I'm also I'm not studying policy per se. I'm a sociologist, and I have to confess that my presentation will be a little bit out of the line from the general panel, because as you can read from the from my title of my presentation, that's not best practice. And the title of my presentation sounds like this: Emigration as a way out of negative experience in post-Soviet space. In post-Soviet reality, and this is the case of Lithuania. So basically, I will try to pick up where Egidijus left and focus more on contemporary issues, and specifically on the relations between Lithuanian immigrants of the last wave and the homeland. Basically, I will explore their connection, the attitude towards the homeland. And as Egidijus already mentioned, during the independence period, based on different calculations, we lost from 700,000 to 900,000 people. So it's huge for the small nation like Lithuania. But another dramatic point in that is that we not only lost the people, but they still have quite a negative attitude towards Lithuania. And I will try to explain why this is so, and on what social aspect it depends. It was believed that some Eastern European countries suffer from depopulation through migration due to lower social standards and way of life in comparing with the West European states. Respectively, motivated young people left their homeland and pursued the better opportunities. However, it was also expected that after adoption of a new socioeconomic system, society will return to new equilibrium. Accordingly, the flows will stop. The flows of the migration will stop or even decrease. Nevertheless, as statistics demonstrate that I mentioned in the beginning, this is not the case in Lithuania. And therefore, the question arises that whether during 30 years of independence, Lithuania has not reached sufficient well-being, or whether the values and mentality of which Lithuanians base their expectations have changed. Obviously, there is a connection between objective circumstances of reality and their subjective perception. But why the direction of these vectors differ? The emotional state of society remained poor, even with the clear improvement in material well-being. So according to statistic poll, 56% of immigrants felt unnecessary in Lithuania. So the development of post-Soviet space, as Egidijus vividly illustrated, is not linear, whether we take it economy, health, politics, education, or any other field. Migration is one of the most distinctive fields in this regard, at least in Lithuania. Even after immigration and achievement of the main goals in personal life, most of them cannot normalize the relations with the homeland. Another poll also illustrates the negativity of Lithuanian immigrants' view towards Lithuania. Later on, I will discuss it in more details, but I was very surprised when we conducted the poll. It was quantitative research, and we left one open question just in case, and it sounded like that. If you want to add something that you weren't asked about, but you think that it's very important, you can name it. And usually in such a questions, you receive few answers only. So in our case, we conducted like 135 answers. out of 1,500 participants of the research. And the vast majority of those answers were expressing the negativity towards Lithuanian government, mainly. So as previous research showed, deterioration of material conditions and disappointment in home country policy making contributes to the drop in pessimistic public mood, and eventually becomes a reason for emigration. It also has been noted that previously exclusive economic motivations are now increasingly supplanted by new migration drivers rooted in social disenfranchisement that goes beyond commonly understood notions of social trust and distrust. Civic engagement, labor activities are supposed to serve to facilitate the transition, but as it become evident, we managed to build a capitalist system with relatively low level of capitalist mentality. This is a notion by a famous Lithuanian sociologist. And what does it mean? It means that we have expectations toward a capitalistic system, but we not fully understand how does it work, and we do not want to engage ourselves into that so that it would provide the benefit according to our expectations, according to our needs. The lack of which, along with a very modest civic engagement, have paradoxical effect. On the one hand, prevents a breakthrough in further democratic development. On the other, fosters unrealistic expectations towards government, as I mentioned at the beginning, without fostering active personal engagement in either of those domains, eventually becoming a source of poor emotional state. In trying to understand the frustration of society, it is important to talk not only about objective structure, but also about how different groups feel in it. From sociological point of view, objective differences cannot alone explain people's choices. Thus, it is crucial to grasp subjective thinking that unfolds in that particular context. To take into account objective and subjective aspects by studying specific cases of dissatisfaction in particular context, like examining the burden of specific groups and its subjective perception. It is important to find out whether and how this may be related to difficulties encountered at different levels of social hierarchy and subjectively constructed expectations. Accordingly, in this presentation, I will try to examine how migrants' subjective account on home country, on civic participation, labor experience, and emotional state are associated with the migrant clusters, which we formed on the basis of socioeconomic characteristics that I will present in a minute. So having empirically identified main disappointment sources and its subjective perception, it is possible to model the respondents' expectation towards the state and reflections on their personal role. This would contribute to explanation of non-economic immigration reasons, demonstrating how a situation before immigration and concrete factors, in this case civic participation, labor experiences, and emotional state, might become potentially important for immigration. In order to better understand the subjective experience of different social groups, some sociologists or anthropologists suggest focusing on emotional experience, like social suffering. That refer to everyday social and cultural realities. The main authors that I use is Pierre Bourdieu and Charles Worth and others. The desire to replace established concepts such as social exclusion with less common concept of emotional state is linked to their ability to reflect the subjective experience of social reality, to highlight the relationship between social processes and its subjective experience. It is common to assume that circumstances of labor market or civic participation may promote social exclusion, but at the same time it may be a focal point for formation of negative emotions. By analyzing the sentiments expressed by immigrants and their emotions, we can gain a deep understanding of certain social contexts in which certain emotions are born and formed. So as we know from previous studies, poor emotional state and inability to experience positive emotion have social consequences. Those groups that feel emotionally excluded from society assume that their hopes and expectations are unrealistic. According to Bourdieu and Charlesworth insights on social suffering as an outcome of social inequality and trying to better understand the extent of the discrepancy between objective reality and its subjective perception in the post-Soviet reality could be linked to the theoretical notion stemming from democratization perspective, which discuss the interrelation between democratic structure and the level of participation, having very practical consequences for the quality of life. Not only civil participation, but also positive emotions grow out of sincere concern with and personal responsibility for public affairs. Thus, personal participation in civic and labor activities supposed to not only serve as facilitators of transition, but also as an area of self-manifestation, possibly leading to a positive experience that strengthens the relations with the homeland. So now I move to empirical part of the research, and I will briefly present the methodology. As I mentioned, it's a quantitative poll conducted in 2018. The beginning of the year, we questioned 1,500 respondents, and mainly we focused on European region, mainly focusing on 3 different parts of Europe in which our largest communities lives. So those areas are Scandinavia, Great Britain, and southern part of the Europe. The structure of socio-demographic data of the survey participant corresponds with official data. So it reaffirmed that the majority of Lithuanian immigrants are youngsters under 35 years old, as well as that majority of immigrants have high education degree and are active in labor market. So in order to better understand the differences among Lithuanian immigrants, we performed cluster analysis, as I mentioned in the beginning, based on the concept of socioeconomic status. And our main variables to identify the clusters were education, income, and employment. So after that analysis, we gathered 3 clusters. The first cluster, the size of 661 person, the cluster center consists of those who study, mainly school children and students, or those who have not yet started working careers, or unemployed, whose income is fairly distributed among 3 lower and middle income groups. The relatively name of this cluster, we name it learning youth, associating with the socioeconomic characteristic that is dominant in the group. The second cluster is a bit smaller, it's 103 participants. The cluster center consists of also of low and middle educated, low income, skilled and unskilled workers with the low labor market adaptability, uncompetitive wages and lack of prospects. Most of them young and middle-aged people. The relative name of this cluster, we call it a Precariat, is associated with the conceptually the more specific also feature of this group. And last cluster, which size is also similar, 429 participants, the cluster center consists of very well educated, middle and upper income, adaptable working age citizen. The relative name of this cluster is potential, and it is associated with the significant discursive notion that the departure of this group is interpreting as a brain drain of nation's potential. So having these 3 clusters, we conducted further analysis with trying to see what are the correlations with the 3 topics that I mentioned at the beginning, that is civic participation, emotional experience, and labor experience. Because the idea was that you can be dissatisfied, you can have expectations, but how significant your expectations and dissatisfaction is if you are not involved in any activity. So I won't go into details what kind of questions we used, but just to give you a brief understanding of what we tested, I will mention the topics that we tested empirically. So in the case of civic engagement, we asked about activity in elections, professional and leisure organizations, trust in other people, priorities towards responsibility for well-being of public life, and etc. In case of labor experience, we asked about employers' respect to employees, the level of stress at work, satisfaction with salary, career opportunities, and merit evaluation. The last topic was the most difficult and challenging because it's not easy to test emotional experience. So we made a compromise that we won't go into emotions per se, but we will ask generalized attitude of the people towards Lithuania and government and people themselves. So, for instance, we have the questions like, I was unable to be happy while living in Lithuania. We had also a question about emotional state while living in Lithuania. So it was, we asked about whether they feel necessary or unnecessary, were they able to be happy living in Lithuania, were they satisfied with the government, or were they unsatisfied with the people. And the last question was, I was happy and I felt sad that I had to leave, or the contrary question was, I was unhappy and felt glad that I had to leave. So I won't, as I mentioned, won't discuss the results and details, but I will jump into conclusions of out of that particular public poll. So what we saw is that the representative of the cluster 2, which we called the Precariat, and cluster 1, which we call learning youth, expect a lot from government, but at the same time do not engage in civic activities, do not ensure proper representation of their interests, nor communicate their needs, thus getting themselves into quite limited experience with a poor emotional state. Unfulfilled expectations result in subjectively experienced disappointment for which bad government is to blame. Representatives of both clusters are rather dissatisfied with salary and career aspects. Accordingly, the emotional state is not well, but somehow differs. Given the essential feature of the first cluster, which is youth, could be made a cautious assumption about a still developing emotional capital. On the other hand, it is somewhat unexpected that a large part of this cluster stated that they were unhappy in Lithuania. 44% mentioned this answer. And felt unnecessary, also 59%, while living in Lithuania. Meanwhile, the most specific feature of the second cluster is the worst emotional state. The smallest part of the representatives of this cluster felt happy and necessary, and vice versa. The largest part felt unhappy and unnecessary. Only representative of third cluster, which we call potential, were more active, which indicates their better self-perception as the creators of the public good and contributors to the country's well-being. Despite the stress experience and objective pay gap differences among the clusters, this cluster, unlike others, did not face the same pressure as others because they were more respected, had better career opportunities, and felt valued. Accordingly, the third cluster was characterized by the best emotional state. The proportion of those in this cluster who felt happy and needed were significantly higher than in other clusters. The lack of personal commitment and community sense sadly affect the forms of society coexistence, which becoming more alienated, less empathetic, and relations among groups more pragmatic. The lack of adequate balance between expectations and personal commitment has also negative consequences for the adequate perception of reality. According to the study, those groups that are more prone to mistrust, non-participation, and avoidance of personal responsibility are also likely to value worse such aspects as respect from employers, the assessment of their merit, and suffer from worse emotional state. The research showed that civic participation and labor environment for certain groups in society did not become facilitators in domesticating new order in the homeland, but became a source of negative emotions. Market economy divides society into winners and losers. However, important is to talk not only about the objective socioeconomic gap between the groups, but also about subjective perception, how this gap is interpreted and experienced by different social groups. What feeling does it evoke? It looks like in the post-Soviet space, not objective criteria, not the differences between countries, but the nuances of subjective satisfaction or dissatisfaction are dominating. It is therefore important to deconstruct this context that generates negative emotions, which permeates reality and overshadows the objective gains made since independence, which undoubtedly contributes to the classic problems of pushing out of the country. Based on subjective reflections on civic participation and labor experience and emotional state by research participants, emigration could be interpreted as a way out of negative experience in post-social reality. Finally, it is not surprising that even after emigration, the attitude of Lithuanians towards the homeland does not change. Attitude remains critically negative, as I mentioned. Interestingly, the quality of life of larger part of population remains debatable. For example, on one hand, an emotional uplift is declared immediately after emigration, as if the freedom from negative experience has been achieved, but on the other hand, a deep analysis reveals that behind these declarations, there is still a lingering shadow of those negative experiences. In other words, in many cases, emigration does not necessarily imply the qualitative change. The same forms of disorganization prevail in immigration, which eventually and inevitably prolong the same frustration. In many cases, just as in Lithuania, the forms of meaning provided by civic participation have not been taken up abroad because there is lack of organizational life, the wish for joint action and cooperation, which would foster a sense of community and meaning. The potential is there, as Egidijus mentioned, but there is no easy way to get rid out of negative aspects and experience in post-Soviet space, which in reality are not necessarily rooted in a specific geographical area, but are embedded in the habits of our communal life. Thank you for your attention.